Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down, oh glory. Praise the Lord.
Welcome to the Harvester Podcast. We are happy that you are with us in Season 3, and this is episode number 7. We have been discussing the existence of God, actually lessons on Christian apologetics, and of late we've been studying the existence of God, and in this episode 7, we're going to focus on premise number 3 in moral argument number 2, or simply put, a continuation of moral argument number 2. And we are the host. I am Brian Kenyon from the South Florida Avenue Congregation, and with me are
Stephen Ford,
George Beals,
and Forrest Antimaceris is usually with us. Well, I say usually, but that's kind of relative now because he hadn't been with us for a few in a row. But I have talked to him, and he is very busy with two children at home, and situations going on there. So he will join us. He's still part of this podcast, but he is going to come with us. But anyway, as we get to the argument and we get to the issue at hand, you know, the moral argument for God. And George, if you will just bring us up to date from the last episode, and we will get started with the new material.
All right. So by way of review, the moral argument for the existence of God, we talked about that last episode, and I called that the moral argument number 2. We looked at some helpful preliminary observations to think about from Thomas B. Warren. He explains that to justify the claim that an action is evil, what ought not to be done, there must be an objective standard, that is, some law that action violates. So if we know that there is evil, then we know that a law was violated. And in the Warren-Flew debate, Flew being an atheist, 1976 debate, he puts it like this. Flew says the Nazis were guilty of real, objective, moral wrong. That means real, moral wrong, which entails an objective standard. Continues, an objective standard that is some higher law. And then Warren presses the question, what law then did the Nazis violate? He continues, it cannot be the law of England or the law of America, for they were not under the jurisdiction of England or America. It cannot be past pre-Nazi German law, for the Nazis made their own laws for their time. As Justice Robert Jackson had said at Nuremberg, it was some higher law that transcends the provincial and the transient. Unquote. The provincial is the area of Germany, the geographical area, and the transient is the period of time in which the Nazis had charge of Germany. So above what is involved in a certain locality during a certain period of time would be the law that they must have violated. Also, Warren points to such an objective standard as the only justifiable basis upon which one can judge that there is more moral degeneration in a society or moral progress. So moral argument 2 proceeds like this. Premise number 1, if we can know that there is an objective moral evil, then we can know that there is a transcendent law that can be violated. Premise number 2, if we can know that there is a transcendent law that can be violated, then we can know that there is a transcendent moral lawgiver, which we call God. That is, you cannot have a transcendent law without there being a transcendent lawgiver. Premise 3, and pay particular attention to this, we can know that there is objective moral evil. And then, premise 4, we can know that there is a transcendent law that can be violated, that just combines 1 and 2. And then finally, therefore, we can know that there is a transcendent moral lawgiver, namely God, combining premises 2 and 4. So again, we pointed out that the argument turns on its premise number 3, namely, we can know that there is objective moral evil. And we ended with the question, well, how do we know that there is objective evil then? And the purpose of today's episode is to answer this question. And we'll end up with 3 individual reasons. Toward that end, we can begin by asking some additional questions. Number 1, did the Nazis commit immorality in their treatment of the Jews in the 1940s? And second, did Charles Manson, for example, and followers commit immorality in the Tate and LaBianca killings in 1969? Another, did Philip Garrigo commit immorality when he kidnapped 11-year-old J.C. Dugard in 1991, held her captive for 18 years and fathered 2 daughters with her by force. And then also, did Richard Allen Davis commit immorality in the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas and the sexual assault, 1993? And did Brian David Mitchell commit immorality when he kidnapped 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart in 2002, and according to Elizabeth, raped her every night from June 2002 to the time that he was caught in March of 2003? Also, do people today commit immorality when they do such acts as those above? And should each of the perpetrators in all of the above have known better? And many answer that yes. So again, on what justified basis can one answer yes to these questions? And one of the answers is by natural law, what is termed natural moral law. So let's look at some of the key terms that relate to all of this. As a matter of interest, read also some Bible passages that relate to this discussion. The term guilty, that means blameworthy, at fault, culpable. The online Merriam-Webster dictionary defines culpable as meriting condemnation or blame, and so being held accountable. And then sin. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. So 1 John chapter 3, verse 4 in the Bible, violating God's law. That's what sin is. And then there is this idea of a conscience, that capacity within us that tells us to do what we believe is right and avoid what we believe is wrong. And guilt results if we violate this inner so-called voice. And then again, what about what many have called natural law, this natural moral law, this what is sometimes called unwritten moral law? Francis J. Beckwith at Baylor provides a concise definition of this natural law. He says, quote, a universal law to which people of all races, classes, cultures, and religions have access by their natural reason, or is it innate? Natural law thus serves as a bridge, he continues, a bridge category on ethical and social questions between church and world. Wasn't this the basis upon which the Nazis were tried and convicted at Nuremberg in 1945-46? Isn't this natural law, the higher law that's above the provincial and the transient? And isn't this what is referenced with the term crimes against humanity? It's interesting that the United States Declaration of Independence affirms natural law. Note this, quote, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which, now note, the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The Declaration of Independence of the United States continues, now note this, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, and then it continues. So notice these references to these truths that are said to be self-evident, and that people have been endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The point here is, the claim is that there are these laws, even outside of the Bible or some holy book, that people should know. Thomas Aquinas, for example, back in the 13th century A.D., held that if any human law does not conform to natural law, we are not obligated to submit to that human law, for it is no law. And whether or not you agree with Martin Luther King Jr. in all respects, this was the basis he used to justify his advocacy of civil disobedience. See, for example, his 1963 open letter titled Letter from Birmingham Jail. So this is quite interesting. And is this thinking about natural law that is determinable outside of the Bible? Is that consistent with what the Bible itself says over in Romans chapter 13? Compare also Acts chapter 5, verse 29. The Roman Catholic Church has been a strong defender of natural law. Some Protestant churches accept it, but many have rejected it. But Beckwith observes the standard narrative goes like this. The Catholic Church teaches that human beings are capable of knowing by unaided reason the existence and nature of both God and his moral law. Protestantism, on the other hand, maintains that our cognitive powers, so corrupted by sin, cannot provide to human beings the power to know God and his moral law apart from special revelation. Furthermore, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant famously said, quote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The oftener and more steadily reflect on them, the starry heavens above and the moral law within." So, is there this natural moral law? Further, as an independent matter of interest, does the Bible affirm that there is? And though there is disagreement, some reference passages like the following as proof that the Bible does affirm that there is this natural moral law. For example, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, 2 Thessalonians 1, verse 6, Romans 2, 12 to 16, Romans 5, verses 12 to 14. And I'd like for us to take a few moments and examine each of these. Maybe you, brethren, have something to say before we do that. Anybody?
Yes, well, the passages, of course, will speak for themselves, but I've always considered Romans chapter 1, after Paul writes about the creation of the world, that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Then he goes on to talk about, the sins of the Gentiles, basically here in this passage, and it revolves around three expressions. He gave them up, in verse 24, to uncleanness. He gave them up to vile passions, verse 26. And he gave them over to a debased mind in verse 28. And in that text, there's at least twice, in most translations, twice, and in the King James, there's 3 times where he actually mentions nature, especially, and we've talked about this in previous lessons on homosexuality, but especially in verse 26 and 27, for he says, "For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for that which is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one for another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due them." And so that's telling us it's against nature. And I've always looked at this passage, and the question often comes up, well, what about the tribe in Africa who's never even heard the gospel? Are they lost? Well, of course they are, because people are lost because of sin. But, he's talking here about Gentiles in chapter 1, and he does say they are without excuse in verse 18, and so they violated. They sinned not because of what they didn't know, but because of what they did know from nature and still went against it. Now, in chapter 2 of Romans, he does deal with the Jews who, had to them revelation from the prophets, etc., etc. But they definitely, nature definitely plays a part in what we should know is moral and immoral.
Also, in that same text, verse 21, backing up to verse 20, they could clearly recognize God's eternal power and Godhead, so they were without excuse. But in 21, it says, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And so, going back to the idea of a conscience, it was darkened, which means that they had it, they ignored it, and therefore there was a negative impact. So they had the capacity to be able to know what was good, what was right. They ignored that and went on their own way. And
then the question arises, what was this knowledge that they had? They did not have the written law from the Jews, special revelation that the Jews had. They're being identified here as having committed sin. You cannot sin without having a law violated. So that gives rise again to the question of what law did they violate if it was not the Mosaic law? And it looks like this is pointing to some kind of a law, a natural moral law. So along those lines, let's take a look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. This says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Notice that expression, for this is right. "Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment of promise." Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown comment on this. They say, quote, "Even by natural law, we should render obedience to them from whom we have derived life." And then it continues and says, verse 2 adds the authority of revealed law to that of natural law. So these folks are interpreting Ephesians 6:1 to be a reference to, which references children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right, as something that is derivable from natural law, and then revealed law, namely the Old Testament scriptures themselves, are brought in as a confirmation of that in verse 2. Alfred's Greek Testament comments on verse 1 like this: combines both senses, just according to the law both of nature and of God. Surely it is better to regard the next verse, verse 2, as an additional particular, not the mere expansion of this, unquote. In other words, Alfred is taking the position that verse 2 in Ephesians chapter 6 is an addition, namely from the Mosaic law to the natural law that is referenced in verse 1. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1 appealed to then as being evidence that the Bible affirms that there is natural law.
Yes, and I would back that up as maybe a commentary on that, going back to Romans chapter 1, this time verse 31, where he lists a number of things where the old King James, the third one in the list, is without natural affection. And that word translated natural affection is astorgus. And it's storge. We often hear that when preachers preach about sermons on love. Storge is the love that a parent would naturally have for his child, for her child. But this has the alpha privative in front of it. So if storge is the natural love that a parent would have for a child and the like, then you put the alpha privative in front of it. It's unnatural. It's against nature. And so that word itself kind of points to that. And that's in the same kind of context of Ephesians 6:1. Child-to-parent relationship. And so
this is claiming that it ought to be naturally recognized for children to obey their parents. And if they don't do that, there's something askew there. There's something that they themselves, whether or not they can articulate with great theological finery is a different matter, but way down deep, there should be some kind of a recognition that they're doing something wrong.
Seems like the conscience then is being trained by the reception of the love, the life that they've received. As you mentioned, Jamison, Faust, and Brown had mentioned, that care that they receive seems to demand or require a response of allegiance of some kind, obedience, faithfulness to them that the child would automatically respond to.
An interesting question. How do we account for that? Either that was created when God created human beings, or it's the effect of some natural evolutionary process over millions of years, which is what the naturalists would argue. But the end product of macroevolution is not morality, but survival. So it looks like the nod needs to be given to this as being originated in the mind of God, a loving personal being.
Returning love for love, kindness for kindness.
So then another passage that is sometimes appealed to in the Bible as confirmation that there is such a thing as natural law is 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 6. So that we ourselves boast of you among the churches of God for your patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure. And then verse 6, since, now note this, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who trouble you. So here we have the Apostle Paul writing to the churches in Thessalonica and is acknowledging the fact that they are being persecuted. And then says in verse 6, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who trouble you. Barnes, in his commentary on the passage, says this, many, quote, men themselves believe that it is just that they wicked should be punished. They are constantly making laws and affixing penalties to them under the belief that it is right. Can they regard it as wrong in God to do the same thing? If it is right to punish wickedness here, it is not wrong to punish it in the future world. It will be a righteous thing for God to punish the wicked in a future state, for they are not always punished here as they should. End of quote. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it kind of ties back into the law of sowing and reaping, which comes from nature. You know, you sow a certain seed, you get a certain result. And that seems to be what we have here in a sense, that the persecutors, the unrepentant persecutors, will reap what they sow. Sowing and reaping is a natural law, and so there's a connection with that.
And if it does not happen here in this life,
yeah,
right,
there seems to be something unfinished, which itself looks to something more beyond this life.
That's one of the concepts I think can escape people, in that we sometimes feel that for good people, good needs to happen here in this life. And for bad people, bad needs to happen to them here in this life. I think that was one of the kind of struggles with the book of Job that he and his friends struggled with, thinking that those things need to take place now. But those don't always happen right now. But it is a right thing for unrighteousness to be punished and for righteousness to be blessed or rewarded.
And then the question arises, on what basis do we say that? And some are arguing that, well, this is referring to this natural law. It's just a natural thing that should be recognized, whether or not you have a Bible study about it. Of course, the Bible will give more details, but it should be, according to this thinking, that there is a recognition of law, of right and wrong, that is way down deep within the human soul. Another passage that comes up along these lines, and this one especially, is Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to 16. Let me just read that. This is from the New King James. For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. When Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. So if we can go back, look at verse 14. It says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, the reference here in the overall context is the fact that the Gentiles during the Mosaic age did not have the written law that the Jews had. The Gentiles did not have that written law of God revealed to them, but the Jews did, namely the Old Testament scriptures as we have it today. Romans chapter 3 verses 1 to 2 can be brought in here. Great advantage then has the Jew in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. And then it says in verse 14 of Romans chapter 2, it says again, when Gentiles who do not have the law, now note, by nature do the things in the law. So when Gentiles by means of nature do the things that are in the Old Testament scriptures, the word nature translates the Greek word phusis. Sometimes can mean a long-standing practice, as it does in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 14. That reads, not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is dishonor to him. Compare customary or habit or even second nature. That is, the length of hair is a matter of long-standing practice. It is possible, of course, for a man to have short hair and a woman to have long hair or vice versa. So this, I believe, clearly is showing that the word nature there in that passage is referring to a long-standing practice. However, nature also can mean innate property. Compare the divine nature, phusis, over in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. So I would say that the innate meaning is in mind here in our passage, Romans chapter 2, verse 14. I say this because of the following expression in verse 15, the work of the heart written, a work of the law written in their hearts. Any thoughts on that, brother?
Yes, as it says of the Gentiles, I mean, there's people today that I know and that I've seen that don't have a clue about revealed Scripture, but they still do very nice Christ-like things because to them it's the right thing to do. Like maybe there's some very benevolent people that will help those in need. There are those that will give money to good works, what they consider good works, philanthropists and things like this that do not know the Bible, do not follow the Bible, do not even claim. They may even claim to be atheists, but they still do good things. And I think that kind of goes along with this in the Gentiles, that they still do the things that are written in the law, even though they didn't have a law, because just observation of nature and just the way they are, they will do those things.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that even with the long-standing practice, a person can see kindness being demonstrated, the effect that it has, and desire to be a part of that. So if they are doing good deeds, if they are, in their culture, if they can see, of course, terrible things happen, the fallout of that, they see good things happen, and the result of that, they can know that good things, as you mentioned, Brian, there are people in our world today who are not necessarily Christians nor would affirm any sort of religious affiliation, but they would still do things that they would know culturally may be helpful to people, benevolent to others, and kind in various ways.
And even without even if a culture is resistant to that, teaches the opposite, practices the opposite, go back to the parents and the children situation again. People, I think, would recognize if a child is out of line, is mean-spirited and commits some kind of atrocity against the parent, that there's something askew there. It's just not something it's not right. And we hardly need to have a specific revelation about that in detail to recognize that, I would say. And I think that's what the affirmation is in Romans 1 and also looking at Romans chapter 2. And if I could bring it on to verse 15 and then verse 16 in particular, this is quite substantive. Let me read it once again, verses 15 to 16 of Romans 2. Who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also, notice, something distinct then, also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Looking at that in verse 16 to begin with, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men. Notice then that this expression, so we're talking about God's basis of judging people at the last day in this context. Even things inside that other humans do not know about. If we do something, we have these even secret things, it says. So in particular, references made in context to Gentiles who were without the written law, and that everybody, Gentile and Jew alike, everyone is going to face a day when God will judge even the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel, he says. So this picture is painting a picture, this passage rather, is painting a picture of a legal setting. Think of a courtroom, and there are several distinct entities that are identified in this picture of Romans 2, 15 to 16. Entity number one is the reservoir of knowledge in the Gentile's heart, that is, his mind. It contains the natural moral law. Notice the text does not say the law written in their hearts, but the work of the law written in their hearts. The work is the carrying out of the law. That is, these Gentiles do have the moral law in their hearts, plus a step beyond that, the intent to carry it out as well. Verse 15, who show the work then of the law written in their hearts. Then a second entity that is included in this picture of Romans 2, 15 to 16 is the conscience. And this is quite interesting. This is distinct from the reservoir of knowledge in the mind. This is proved by the word also in the New King James, or therewith in the American Standard Version. Verse 15 in the New King James reads, your conscience also bearing witness. In verse 15 in the American Standard, their conscience bearing witness therewith. So the conscience is distinct from the reservoir of knowledge that was just referenced. The conscience is a prompter. It prompts us to do the right over the wrong, but does not tell us what the right thing is. Thus, it is different than the moral knowledge that is in the mind. The conscience then accompanies that knowledge. Doing the actual right requires both the prompter, the conscience, and the accompanying knowledge of the actual right. So there is this conscience, and there are different meanings of the word with, maybe we should point out. One meaning is the with of means. I traveled here, for example, by means of my automobile. Another is the with of accompaniment. Maybe my wife was with me. The Greek word translated also bearing witness, or bearing witness therewith, is a form of the compound word sum mutareo. Sum means with, or of accompaniment, and mutareo means to bear witness, so to bear witness with. Furthermore, it's interesting to note, too, that the Greek and English word for conscience also has sum in it, and conscience from Latin. Conscience, Latin, with knowledge, sum, conscience, from Greek, with knowledge. So there is the conscience that is with the knowledge that's written in the hearts. A third entity in this picture of Romans 2, 15 to 16 is that there are thoughts accusing or else excusing. Now, this appears to overlap with the civil war within each of us that Paul references over in Romans chapter 7, verse 15. This reads, what I will to do, that I do not practice, but what I hate, that I do. That is, on Judgment Day, as a defendant before God, my thoughts, my awareness of and acknowledgement of my righteous actions and sinful actions will come to mind in that proceeding. And then there's a fourth entity in this meaty passage, Romans 2:15-16. There is the judge. The omniscient God will declare guilt or innocence and declare sentencing. Furthermore, in the overall context, over in Romans chapter 3, all will be guilty. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Compare that also with Romans chapter 14, verses 10-11. For we all shall stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. Note that for the saved, Jesus is both judge and successful defense attorney. Over in 1 John chapter 2, verse 1, that reads, If anyone sins, we have an advocate, a parakletos, the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. And then furthermore, another entity in Romans 2, 5-16, picture that's painted there, there is the gospel. And this will be the overall objective standard of judgment, overall basis. According to my gospel. Compare this with Acts 17:30-31. Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world, that's everybody, Jew, Gentile, righteousness, by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. And then Hebrews 11, verse 15, then chapter 12, verse 1. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them from afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Hebrews 11, verse 13. This includes then Abel, Noah, Abraham before the Old Law, David during the Old Testament Law, and the Gentile Rahab, who lived during the Old Testament Law. So next, I raised the question, maybe for some discussion here, what then is in the moral law? Any thoughts on that? We've already touched upon that with Romans 1, Brian. Any further thoughts there?
Well, when we look at the entities that you mentioned there, then entity number 1, for example, there's a reservoir of knowledge in the Gentile's heart that is in his mind. Well, the text says it didn't come from God's special revelation, so the only other place it could have come from was natural revelation. Now, of course, there might be some things in their laws, whatever those would have been, that reflected God's law, because from nature they knew that was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. When you think of entity number 2, there's a conscience. Well, we've proven earlier that conscience cannot come from macroevolution, that it has to have been created by God in human people or humankind, and that's entity number 2. And then entity number 3, the thoughts either accusing or else excusing, and that's kind of the conscience working there. But again, this did not come from special revelation from God. And then, of course, entity number 4, there is a judge, and of course that judge is God, is Christ. We know that from other passages. Now, of course, how much knowledge the Gentiles had of that, we do not know, but all of those entities in the gospel, all those entities, well, of course, the latter two, the judge and the gospel, come from God, of course, and we know that through special revelation. Entities 1 through 4 have to come from nature, ultimately from nature. Ultimately from God's creation of man as he observes nature.
And, of course, Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That includes people who lived from Adam up to the present time through all those dispensations, part of which the Gentiles did not have the law, yet they've all sinned. Well, you can't have sin without being a law. That implies, therefore, they had to have had some law that they violated in order to be the sinners that they are and that we are.
I would think that there are some things that we could know that might be a part of that. For example, you go back before the law of Moses, you look in the book of Genesis, Abraham lies multiple times about his wife, in fact, being his sister when she wasn't. And the 2 times he did, the individuals, when confronted with that information, knew that was wrong. The first, Pharaoh was like, why would you do this? Even though his house was plagued, that wasn't his complaint. It wasn't, hey, why'd you cause my house to get plagued? I don't know what's going on. Just make it stop. It was a very specific, why did you lie and cause this calamity? And so Pharaoh, at that point, prior to the law of Moses, understood that having another person's wife wasn't good. And so while we may not be able to know every facet of what was part of that, we can know that there were some things that were just congruent with the nature of God and his will, as it has been even later revealed, that were wrong to them that they would have been aware of.
As to what is in the moral law, some point, we've already talked about this a little bit, some do point to Romans 1:18 to 32 as evidence of at least some of the content of the moral law. Others, Boa and Krudanier, for example, point to Amos 1:3 to chapter 2, verse 3, where the basis of Gentile judgment versus Jewish judgment is found in Amos's prophecy. Notice what the Gentiles were accused of being guilty of there. That would give you some insight, according to this thinking, as to the content of this moral law. Thomas Aquinas thinks that the principles of natural law follow from 5 natural inclinations in us. And, of course, we'll take truth where we can find it. He says inclination to do the good, for self-preservation, for sexual union and upbringing of offspring, for knowing truth and living in society. Regarding the last one, compare friendship and justice. Also consider the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So an interesting question is recognizing the golden rule natural in the human being? That is, can we expect people to know that and behave accordingly without even learning it from the Bible? Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. Any thoughts on that? Is the golden rule way down deep and something that's confirmed in the Bible, but just part of being human?
I think you can make a case for that.
Yeah, I would think so. While you might have a time finding it an explicit statement as such, I think you can find implications by the behavior of people, that they would know you treat other people in the same way you would want to be treated. You find that in just about every culture, and you can see it demonstrated in the Bible.
That sounds like written in the work of the law written in their heart. The work, so they had the intent to carry it out. It's not only in there, but they're going to behave accordingly. And there's some of that in society. There are some other works that we're not going to have time to get into in detail, but maybe I just reference some of these, several books on the subject as to what is in the moral law, and you may want to consult these, audience members. One is by Haynes and Fulford, Natural Law, A Brief Introduction and Biblical Defense. Another is by Samuel Gregg, The Essential Natural Law. Another is by Stuart Banner, and this is interesting. This is put out by Oxford University Press in 2021. The Decline of Natural Law, How American Lawyers Once Used Natural Law and Why They Stopped. Now, given that the moral law, the natural moral law, is in us, how did it get in us is another question. That is, how did the specific concepts of the moral law get into the human mind? One gentleman wrote a book titled The Law in the Heart, but Bales is his name, and he provides some helpful information on this particular question. He holds that there is a law in the heart, but says Paul does not tell us how it got there. Bales says that it is a matter of speculation, therefore, but he then provides a summary of some possibilities. I understand Bales to be saying this: at least some moral precepts are in us, could very well be from truths that God revealed to early man during Bible times, which have been handed down ever since. But there seems to be a natural sense of morality inherent in each human. He says either innate in the soul or springing up in it as the inner life unfolds, and the child thinks on the universe around it. This seems to be analogous to our having the capacity to think rationally, for example, recognizing and following universal laws of logic. And then another passage that sometimes is appealed to is Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 14, where it is claimed that the Bible affirms that there is this thing called a natural moral law. Some offer this as proof. This passage reads, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world." Now note that. "But sin is not imputed where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses." Let me read that again. "Sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam," that would be before the law, "to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come." So, verse 12 of that passage, "For just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned." And so then, if there is sin, there is death, and if there is death, there is sin. And then verse 13, "For until the law," that would be a reference to the Old Testament law given at Sinai, in Exodus 20, I believe. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Further then, if there was sin, then there was law that was transgressed. And so then there was law between Adam and the giving of the law on Sinai. So verse 14, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses. Now note this, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam. So if we were to paint a picture, maybe a graphic, a vertical line stands for Adam, another vertical line to the right that stands for Moses, there was existing law between Adam and Moses. Those who sinned not according to the likeness of Adam equals non-special revelation equals natural moral law would be the argument here. Now, there's a caution to keep in mind. We need to be very careful, be discerning regarding natural law, formulate it carefully, watch the implications of what we claim. If you argue for it, then expect to be asked to explain passages like Jeremiah 10:23. The way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his steps. But I believe the reference there is to a recognition of knowledge. This is not referring to the source of knowledge. So, additional passages that might be of interest pertaining to that premise 3 way back near the beginning in moral argument 2. How do we know that there is objective moral evil? Well, consider what we've already said up to this point. Consider also Isaiah 7:16. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, note that, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. So there is a time then before a child knows the distinction between refusing evil and good. And furthermore, Proverbs 8, verse 17, I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. I don't believe that God has left us alone. God is involved providentially in helping us to find him. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. So if there is sin, there will be death. If there is sin, there must have been law that was violated. Romans 4, verse 15, where there is no law, there is no transgression. Be careful on this one. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. But then in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so then there is transgression, and therefore there must be law. Where there is no law, there is no transgression, but there is transgression. Therefore it must be that it is false that there is no law. With all of this information then, along with the question on natural law, I offer 2 graphics for discussion. The first one is this. Of course, if folks were seeing the graphic, we wouldn't have to draw a word picture, but many are listening to this, I think, maybe by radio without looking at a computer. So let me paint this picture and maybe get some discussion on this. Is the situation today then during the New Testament age the following? Draw a circle and let that circle represent the universal New Testament. Jesus said in Matthew 20:18, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. So today we are under the authority of Jesus Christ, and this is found in the New Testament. And thus we are under written revelation today. All of us are. But within the universal New Testament, there does appear to be this universal natural law, which is a part of the law under which people are today, and that this then would be repeated in the all-perfect and all-sufficient New Testament scriptures. And furthermore, the universal natural law would be adequate to condemn, but not adequate to save. On the other hand, the New Testament passages in the Bible are adequate to save. Any thoughts on this? Is this the picture today?
Yes, I think that's a good point you just made. Adequate to condemn, but not adequate to save. And I could go in to explain Jeremiah 10:23 as well, that natural law doesn't give us everything. In the Old Testament, the sacrifices, you have to have special revelation for that, but natural law does tell you things like it's wrong to commit adultery, it's wrong, homosexuality, things like that. That list in Romans 1, and so I think that's a very good way to look at that. And the circles, the overall New Testament law is the big circle, and then that little circle has universal natural law, but that universal natural law is included in the universal New Testament law that we have today, and that's a good point.
And I would say that would have to be the case in order to be true to 2 Timothy 3:16 to 17. all Scripture is inspired of God and profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, instruction, that the man of God might be complete, thoroughly furnished unto every good work. So every good work is discernible from the New Testament Scriptures. But some good works are determinable by this natural law, which would be part of the New Testament, repeated in the New Testament. But, of course, the New Testament includes more than that.
Right. So it's not that they have something unique, separate, independent that, that they're being governed by.
Excellent. So everybody is under the New Testament today.
Exactly. Every person is amenable to the New Testament.
Right. But some of that is detectable by natural law. But that's only going to be of such a nature that you might be condemned by it. But in order to learn how to become saved and be heaven-bound today, you have to go into the New Testament Scriptures.
Yeah, and even just with that graphic, if you just take that little circle within the little circle called natural law within the big overall circle called universal New Testament law, you just take that little circle as being Romans 1. All those sins listed there, those are, you can know by nature that they are wrong, but every single one of those is dealt with in the New Testament, morally, the overall New Testament, the special revelation.
Again, in order to be true to the statement, the claim in the New Testament Scriptures that it includes every good work. We can determine any work, whether it is good or not, by reading the New Testament Scriptures. The answer has to be found in order to be true to the very claim in 2 Timothy 3:16 to 17. There is one last graphic that I'd like for us to think about. If we could identify and discuss the legislation upon which people living at different times will be judged in the last day according to the Bible. God's special revelation or by God's natural law. So you go way back to way on the left-hand side, draw a horizontal line from that point way over to the right, and then draw a vertical line way over there on the left and call that the creation of humans, Genesis 1:26-27. And then we have the Genesis chapter 3, the first human sin, Adam and Eve. And then we have Exodus 20. After that, the giving of the Old Testament law, beginning at Sinai. And then over in Acts chapter 2, much later, of course, in the first century, the first Pentecost after the resurrection of Jesus. Here we have the Christian age beginning. And then way over to the right, we've got Judgment Day, John 5:28-29, John chapter 6, verse 44. So the people who lived between Genesis 1:26-27, creation, to the time of Genesis 3, in there was no human sin yet, correct?
Correct.
So
but
there was no judgment.
Adam did have special revelation of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it.
And then sin enters the picture in Genesis chapter 3, and we've got people who sinned according to the likeness of Adam, and those that did not sin according to the likeness of Adam. Two groups there. It looks like the distinction there is, and I welcome your thoughts on this. It looks like the legislation that was according to the likeness of Adam would be the revealed law that was given to Adam, and he may have passed it on to his immediate family and so forth. But then you'd come to a time when there would be people that were outside of that did not have access to the special revelation that was even given to Adam and passed down. These would have lived in between Genesis 3 and the giving of the law. These then would have been judged, will be judged on the day of judgment by natural law.
Yeah, even some in that time period would have received special revelation. Like, for example, Cain and Abel would have had to have received special revelation in their worship. Hebrews writer says it was by faith, but also, the Gentiles were congruent with the Jews so far as, their existence all the way to the cross,
Right.
Ephesians 2. And
But that's over in Exodus chapter 20. So the people who lived between Genesis 3 and Exodus 20 did not have a knowledge of the special revelation that was given to Adam. It looks like they would be judged by natural law. And then what about the folks from Exodus 20 to Acts 2? There you'd have the Jews who had the law, the Mosaic law, and the Gentiles, that's referenced back in Romans 1, who did not have the law. The Gentiles would be judged by the natural law, and the Jews would be judged by the legislation that was given to them. And then in Acts chapter 2, now we have the abrogation of all of it. The Mosaic Law, it was nailed to the cross, and now the New Testament is given, and Jesus has all authority everywhere. Now, from Acts chapter 2 until the final coming of Christ, everybody will be judged by the New Testament. Jesus said again, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth, Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. And so then today, people need to learn the saving message of Jesus Christ. I think of Acts 17, 30 to 31. The times of ignorance, therefore, God overlooked, but now he requires all men everywhere to repent. And I do not believe that we're alone in that. I don't believe that God has left us alone to fend for ourselves. I do believe that God in his providence will see to it that anyone today who would obey the gospel, the saving message of Jesus Christ, given the opportunity, that they will be given that opportunity somehow or another. I base that on passages such as Proverbs 8:17. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. And then, of course, then we have the day of judgment, John 5 referenced. And all then will be separated, either like goats and sheep, Matthew chapter 25.
You were referencing it just a little while ago, Acts chapter 17, right there in that same passage, verse 27, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far away, or far rather, from every one of us. So God is able to be found if we are seeking him. So the evidence shows that there is a God. The evidence points that we should seek after God, and if we do seek him, we will be able to find him.
And I think there's a wonderful passage, and that word to seek there is in the Greek is a present infinitive. So that means keep seeking. So God has put us in this world, and it should trigger in us a desire to come to a knowledge of God, that he exists, and then keep seeking. And with his assistance, I believe that all people who love the truth, given the opportunity, will obey the truth, will have that opportunity. And there is no question about it, according to the New Testament scriptures. People must learn the gospel of Jesus Christ and obey it in order to be heaven-bound. And so then, by way of conclusion, going way back to premise 3 and moral argument number 2, we can know that there is objective moral evil, and that applies all the way through from creation, all the way through into the final coming of Christ. I believe that the answer then to that question is, how can we know that this is true? How can we know that there is objective moral evil? We can know it because there is natural law. We can know it by the Bible. And also, I believe another line of reasoning would be the distinction between subjective ethics and objective ethics, and this would lead to the conclusion that there must be a standard that is the basis of following God's will, and thus we are led to Jesus Christ.
All right. That was a very intense lesson, and a lot of good comments could be made, but we just simply don't have the time. But if
we
you
did take the time that time.
Yeah, we take
in
the
many
time.
respects.
Yes.
It's a lot of material, but it's good stuff.
Yeah, very good stuff.
And we would encourage our hearers to go over it.
Yes, and if you have questions or want further details or maybe some bibliography, George mentioned earlier some sources that you look at, just let us know. Email us, and let us know. Florida School of Preaching, FSOP@FSOP.net is the email, and we'd be happy to study this further with you. But we thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next episode, number 7, where we continue our discussion of Christian apologetics.
Salvation has been brought down, oh glory, praise the Lord. Blessed Lord, salvation has been brought down from heaven. Go and shout, and tell it the world around. Go preach it and tell it today to people in sorrow. Tell it today and tell it tomorrow. Preach the word of God that we might win a shining crown. Heaven tell the lost, all the lost, salvation is full and free. To sinners friends and blessedness over the land and sea. Go teach it and tell it afar in